we've gathered this evening to participate in a conversation on moral courage and guns, and hope to approach the matter from a variety of angles. Gun violence in America, meaning shootings and homicides and suicides, occurs at a greater frequency here than any other industrialized nation in the world. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime recently determined that of the 644 million civilian-owned guns around the globe, US civilians own about 42%. That is, according to their calculations, 270,480,000 guns on American soil. This means, for a population of 327 million people, there are about 270 million guns. And so, the proliferation of mass shootings, to the persistent gun violence that occurs daily across many neighborhoods and communities in our country, it is time that we address the need for moral courage in fighting for effective gun legislation and practices. Underlying these statistics, though, is a culture, our culture, one that makes it possible for these conditions to manifest. It was Reinhold Niebuhr, a renowned social ethicist, who once wrote, quote, "The prosperity of America is legendary. Our standards of living are beyond the dreams of most of the world. We are a kind of paradise of domestic security and wealth. But we face the ironic situation that the same technical efficiency which provided our comforts has also placed us at the center of the tragic elements in world events," end quote. This was written in 1952, but the melancholic thrust of this statement still bears true today. Like other institutions, the Boston University School of Theology is a microcosm of the larger society. Just as the public remains closely divided on controlling guns and protecting rights, we too likely harbor a range of perspectives on how best to approach this issue. However, we hope that in our gathering here tonight as students of theology who are hoping to nurture peace in the world, that we might engage together in an exploration of how to courageously advocate for more life and less death in our country. Our esteemed guest panelists will help us better understand the problems leading to and arising from gun violence, the kinds of discourse taking place at different levels of advocacy for and against gun reform, and how each of us can make a substantive difference. First, we have Reverend Cornell William Brooks, Esquire, visiting professor of social ethics, law, and justice movements here at the Boston University School of Theology and the Law School. Reverend Brooks is a BUSTH graduate, received his JD from Yale University, and was invited to teach here in the midst of an impactful career as a civil rights attorney and leader. He recently served for 3 years as president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, which is the oldest civil rights organization in the country. We're very fortunate to have him with us. Also with us today is Kenneth Elmore, Associate Provost and Dean of Students at BU. Dean Elmore coordinates university efforts to provide a safe environment where students can find their way within a vibrant academic community. In his development as an educator and as a human being, Dean Elmore has been encouraged, supported, nurtured, and taught by people of all religions, races, and cultures. Dean Elmore plays his part to keep Boston University, and educational environments as places for people to come together, find passion, write poetry, and to find love. Thank you for being with us. Next is Dr. Judith Oleson, co-director of the SCH Religion and Conflict Transformation Program. Dr. Olson's research and writing include reconciliation processes between indigenous communities, governments, and the church for years of child removal policies that resulted in cultural genocide in the US, Australia, and Canada. She's also interested in the relationship between individual and collective healing and cross-sector partnerships for social change in post-conflict communities. Thank you for being with us too. Last but not least, we have Abrigal Forrester, Director of Community Action for Madison Park Development Corporation, also known as MPDC. MPDC creates affordable housing and has about 1,300 units and houses nearly 3,000 families in Roxbury and neighboring cities. Mr. Forrester manages and directs several community engagement initiatives which include public safety, resident services and leadership, health equity and wellness, youth leadership, and workforce development. He also focuses on violence prevention and believes in redirecting trauma. As a formerly incarcerated citizen, he brings keen insight to this conversation on moral courage and guns. Now, before allowing the panelists to introduce themselves, we have a small activity to check the temperature in the room. I'm going to ask a few questions and invite you to raise your hand if you identify with the question. First question. Who here has participated in conversations in faith communities about the culture of guns in our country? Who here has been threatened by someone with a gun? Who here has had a positive experience seeing a gun used as protection from harm? Who here has lost a friend or family member because of gun violence? Who here has had a positive experience with friends or family using guns for recreation or hunting? Who here believes that our current state of gun regulation and gun culture needs to be improved? Thank you. Now at this time, we return to the panelists. We'll begin here with Reverend Brooks and move our way down. And the question that we're going to open with is just to please share about how your professional or personal experience has included working on issues involving guns and what you see as the most important aspects of framing this issue.
So first of all, let me say thank you to the Dean of the School of Theology who came up with this idea of convening this conversation. Of course, Andrew as a moderator and the students who put this together, as well as our co-panelists. So we are having this conversation today on School Walkout Day. Yeah. It is also a conversation that is taking place in the wake of the Pulse nightclub shooting, the Las Vegas shooting, the Emanuel 9 shooting, the low-grade violence that we see play out in cities like Newark and Detroit and Chicago on a near daily basis. We understand that this conversation takes place in the context of a country in which there are, depending on the estimate, 320 million guns in circulation in a population of about 360 or so million people, where you have 7 to 10 million assault weapons, depending on how you define it. So this conversation takes place in the context of a pervasiveness of the technology in terms of guns, but also a pervasive gun culture. But it also takes place in the Boston University School of Theology, whose legacy rests upon a moral irony, namely the most prominent alumnus of this school and this university, Martin Luther King, an apostle of nonviolence, was in fact himself a victim of gun violence. So we, more than most, understand the moral poignancy of this issue. And so I come to this conversation as a graduate of this school, as someone who studies social ethics and systematic theology, but also as a civil rights lawyer, also as someone who led the NAACP and went to Florida after the Pulse nightclub shooting, went to Mother Emanuel in Charleston after the Emanuel 9, i.e. 9 students of scripture were slain in the church, who's been to the south side of Chicago, the west side of Chicago, to Detroit, worked 6 years in Newark. So this is not an academic issue. It is, for me, an issue that really defines who we are as a society. In other words, do we find ways to recognize the Second Amendment, recognize the Fourth Amendment, but also the right of people to pursue happiness, i.e. in the absence of rampant, pervasive, soul-debilitating, soul-destroying, and physically destroying violence. So I come to the discussion with that frame as in terms of it being a moral issue, a civil rights issue, a policy issue, but at the end of the day, it is an existential issue for a democracy. That may well be the benediction.
I come to this as someone who has been in an academic environment most of my life, as someone who has to always push the questions in the conversation. I also come at this as someone who believes that this is also about a real crisis in civic engagement in the society, and it's at a head right now. And particularly a crisis of youth civic engagement in the society, and that means a crisis of the future of this country and the future of the society as well. I also come at this from a frame of being someone who has struggled with violence in my life, both personal, myself, and also I'm somebody who grew up in an environment where I had to think about how I could do violence to someone else before they could do violence to me. I also grew up in an environment too where we did violence not with guns. It was rare when I grew up that people had them. I grew up in an urban environment, and that was a very different sort of thing for us. And anyone who had them, it was very, very rare. It was almost an honor amongst people with the use of those. I am a Southerner who grew up in an urban environment, part of the Great Black Migration, and someone who has these moral struggles around this idea. For example, I struggle with the notion of whether or not I can be morally straight in 2018 and still call myself someone who's morally straight and own a gun. I struggle with that idea, and I wonder if that plays itself out for other people as well, but certainly, do I want to be in a community where people actually own guns? And I do subscribe a level of moral righteousness to gun ownership or not. What's more, with the civic engagement, and the crisis of civic engagement, I think that there's some aspects of that real specifically that we have to think about, or at least I think about. I think about whether or not this is really about comprehending other people, because we talk about gun culture, and to me, that's understanding gun culture and what that might be. I worry about the way that we put the issue out there. I've been struck that recently we've started to talk a little bit more about gun violence, and not just about some people in Florida. I noticed that even on NPR, they're starting to get voices from other people who've said, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been dealing with this for a long time. I am a young person who's been banding together for years with other people, and we've been talking about this. And I don't want to take away from the tragedy, but it's about time that we've been able to lay this out a little bit better than what we have been able to do. But with that too, I'm concerned about scapegoating. I am concerned about us scapegoating to the extent in which we start to think that we don't have to look at the systems and the ways that we make it easy for people to shoot each other, that we make it easy for people to live in conditions where we flood them with guns and they shoot each other. So I do worry about that. I also worry about the empathy in this conversation, and I worry about the accountability in the conversation. I deal a lot with people who are activists but who don't want any accountability. And I think that that's a really difficult sort of thing. We will have to draw lines. And certainly when we are starting to talk about moral aspects of this, I think that there are lots of lines that need to be considered.
Well, I come to the conversation as someone who's been teaching in the field of peace and conflict transformation for quite a while now. And it was 10 years ago, almost today, that I was at a major peace conference in Switzerland. And we were with people from all over the world dealing with conflict. And a woman stood up, she happened to be from Nigeria, and she said, if you from the West really care about peace, you will do something about your guns. That has been the moral challenge for me. And I started looking into not only gun trafficking across our world and the whole industry of guns and selling guns and illegal drug traffic, but also reflecting upon our own gun industry here and our own use of guns. I became interested in looking at social movements and gun policy and how they interact with each other, tracking both national and international policy, and started attending some gun shows and did observations, what was going on there. I conducted interviews at the NRA. I didn't get very far into the inner sanctum, but people. And several years ago, I worked with the Public Conversations Project to train leaders in the state of Minnesota to facilitate gun dialogues. And they use a model of bringing people of diverse points of view to create a safe space and using methods of inquiry, opening people up to understanding better their experiences. Part of my work with that project was to design and implement a pre and post evaluation that we did before, after, and 6 months later, that looked at not only was there any increase in understanding and respect for each other's position, because the goal was not to change each other's mind, the goal was to understand. And that was a powerful experience for me, and understanding the how much civic engagement and civic dialogue is important for understanding the deep divisions we have in our country. My own personal experience is I also lived for almost 29 years in Minnesota, where there was a culture of hunting and people used guns very responsibly, and it was a wonderful father-son culture of hunting. I have lost several friends to suicide due to guns, and I think this is why I believe it's so important that we frame this issue and use the language of violence reduction instead of gun control, for many reasons. One, because I believe we need to talk about community safety, and also the word control sets off a whole level of resistance and opposition and belief that you're trying to take my guns away. In terms of reframing the issue, I also think it's important to shift from the exchange of the focus on individual rights to community agreements. So we're a very individual rights society, and I believe this gets played out in the gun issue. So reframing the question looks at how do we move away from individual rights and look at collective rights, and how do we make agreements about how do we make our communities safe. I think we also need to understand the real costs of gun violence, and Cook and Ludwig have written a whole book on this. Who pays, but also who profits? And that question is very important because I believe it drives a lot of our gun policy. I've already talked about dialogue and civic engagement. I think it's very important to understand this huge divide and understand where the other comes from, that thinks very differently from you. But I also believe we have to take action, and that we're in a place right now where there's enough collective energy. This has been, the resistance has been there on many, many levels for many, many years. My neighbor had the first gun death. His son was the first college student killed at a college campus. It happened 22 years ago. And that's how long he's been fighting this issue. So people have been working at this really hard, and I think the time now is right, that there's enough collective energy, and in addition to dialogue and understanding, we need to move into action.
All right, good evening. My name is Abrigal, Forrester again, and so I come to this issue from a number of angles. As was mentioned, I was formerly incarcerated. I did 10 years of a mandatory sentence for drug trafficking as a first-time offender. And I share that to say that my experience in my community has been around coming to this issue from looking in the face of mothers who have cried, who can't stop crying because they lost their children to gun violence. And it's something that continues to happen. I also come to this issue in a sense of being frustrated by the fact that we live in a society that honors an issue agenda based on the who. And I say based on the who because, as was mentioned earlier, you know, gun violence is something that we've been dealing with in this country for quite a long time, specifically in urban communities. You would find that even though there's a huge discussion about high impact weapons, that most violence that takes place in our communities, specifically urban communities, are handguns, not even impact weapons. So that discussion about handguns is not even in the conversation because, again, when you start thinking about the issue, you have to think about who's this issue relevant to, right? And when we start talking about policies and legislation, we have to talk about also who are we trying to save. Are we really trying to save everyone from gun violence, or are we being specific to specific populations of people? So I come to this issue with that frustration and saying, how do we broaden the discussion and make sure that this issue of gun violence is relevant to reducing violence in our country as a whole? I also would say that, to me, when we start talking about guns, it's also a byproduct of a number of other issues, right? So in my community, I would say guns are a byproduct of poverty, right? I would say that what we saw in Parkland is a byproduct of a community that I understand where sometimes young people who struggle and don't act like others are ostracized. And that ostracized leads to a level of depression. And that depression then leads to a level of isolation and antisocial behaviors that causes someone to feel like they want to resolve that issue through violence. That violent act ends up being using a high impact weapon. But at the end of the day, if that weapon wasn't available, they may have used something else. And I think about how when we start talking about these legislative issues, we sort of flank the real issue and try to create a level of comfortability for folks who have anxiety. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if we arm teachers with guns, what stops someone from saying, I'll wait till school ends and shoot people as they leave the school? Nothing. So we're still not dealing with the issue, we're dealing with the byproduct of the real, true problem. I also come to this issue as a young man at the age of 11 years old who had a gun put to my head for a nameplate belt. Many of you may not know what a nameplate belt is. Raise your hand if you know what a nameplate belt is. Well, a nameplate belt was something that was very popular. It's having its second coming in sort of like the hip hop spaces, right? It's like this belt, you put your name, you can get like a money sign or whatever represents your internal character that you want people to know. But at 11 years old, I'll never forget walking from one of my best friend's house that was only probably 2 blocks away from my home. And it was dark outside, and I was flashing my nameplate belt, not knowing any better, 11 years old. My mom really took pride in dressing me well. We're from the West Indies, so one of her things was that, you know, you won't walk around representing poverty. You'll look like somebody when you leave this house. Not realizing that actually that created some social threats for me as a young man growing up in a low-income neighborhood. But that being said, had a gentleman walk up to me and put a gun, well, actually showed me the gun and said, give me your belt. I wouldn't give it to him, and he took the gun out and put it to my head. And my mother always says that that is the point where her son's life trajectory changed. So when we start talking about gun violence, to me, or gun control, you know, I go back to my original point is, you know, who are we really talking about when we talk about these issues? Are we really, because for me, when I see this walkout right now, I was having this discussion with my wife, and we were talking about, you know, we talk about microaggression, but we don't talk about microaffirmation. And microaffirmation is that you had young brown and black children throughout this country every day who are being subject to gun violence in their schools, social threats, and no one cries out for them. But then we have a group, again, not being insensitive to the matter, of young folks who experience gun violence in a more traumatic, or I wouldn't even say traumatic, but just in a more sort of in the moment impactful way, and everyone wants to honor their voice. To the point where we'll sit here now in Boston University and have a discussion, but I'm here on the behalf of the babies and the mothers that I know that are crying every day, that deal with this issue day in and day out, and they're actually being traumatized day in, day out, to the point where now they become gun toters just to survive. Thank you.
So now that we've heard about the issue from different angles, we kind of want to ask, since this issue seems so daunting to solve, what have you identified through your work as a key intervention or area for engagement that you think must be considered in order to make change?
I mean, I'll throw something out.
It's open to the phone.
It's
we
like,
do hope to have a conversation. So.
Yeah. It's like I'll start with being slightly cynical about this, but I do think that we have got to just do this ourselves. We cannot wait for government to do this. And when I say do this ourselves, you know, we're talking about people in a school of theology. We're talking about people in an academic community and various communities. We have got to take leadership in our own communities to say stop, enough. We have got to do that ourselves. Government, and here's the cynical part, government's not gonna do anything about this in any substantive way. We know that. We know that. So I say, well, what are we gonna do in our churches, our homes, our schools, our neighborhoods, our communities to capture this and do this ourselves? And I think we've got to find a way to just go ahead and do it because they ain't gonna do it.
So if I can respond to that, I appreciate that point because, you know, I was also having a discussion this weekend about, you know, legislation reform is long-term, right? But I'd love to sort of give this cliche statement of Dr. Martin Luther King that was right in this school of theology that references the urgency of now. And the urgency of now can't wait for 500 more men and women to die in Chicago, the streets of Chicago, for a legislation to be passed 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now in regards to gun reform. You know, I was thinking also about the fact that we, you know, the word that we use and have been hearing to be used in this conversation is moral courage. And so I asked myself, you know, in coming to the School of Theology, is that, you know, what do we mean by moral courage? I mean, we live in a time right now where I feel that we are functioning in the term of common sense in its true meaning. Like the historical meaning of common sense is whatever the commoners feel is okay, that's what makes sense. It's not really like, it's not really what's reasonable. It's that, you know, if 40 out of 50 people say, we think slamming the chair on the ground makes sense, then that's the common, that's what we go with, right? That's where common sense comes from. And so more than ever now, I feel we're in a common sense arena, right? Not a moral arena. I mean, we can say morality because we're in the School of Theology, but the reality is in the world, it's about whatever the commoners are doing, let's roll with it. So I asked myself, what are we really asking people to be courageous about with this issue? And there are two things that I came up with. One is we're asking for empathy courage. And why do I say empathy courage? I think empathy courage is related to the fact that there are young men, like this young man that did this incident in Parkland, who was identified as having issues for a long time. But no one stepped in to actually help him address what he was dealing with. And if there was empathy courage, someone would have said, you know, this young man's functioning in a way that's just not healthy. How can we rally around him, try to pull him out of that dark space? No one did that. Led to this incident. The other piece I would say is also integrity courage. Because integrity courage has to do with the parent, like the father that was in the home where this young man wanted to clean the gun frequently, that never really stepped up and said, you know what, I think this child who's going into the room and isolating himself is having an issue. And how do we sort of do an intervention on that and really take the steps? And I don't want to just focus on that, but I also think it's parents in urban communities who know that their son might be selling drugs or have a gun under the mattress, that their integrity courage allows them to step into a space and take a risk that will prevent the broader society from being injured by that person's own depression or anxiety or mental illness. So those are the things that I think about when it comes to sort of really how do we take some ownership that doesn't allow us to wait for the long-term reform while bodies are being lost by the wayside.
So, you know, it may not be surprising. I guess as a lawyer and a minister, I take a both-and approach. Meaning, to the extent that Dr. King reminded us that you cannot dictate a man, in quotes, a man's attitudes, but you can regulate behavior. And so this is a matter of changing attitudes, but also regulating behavior. So when you look at the evolution of civil rights in this country, when you look at the conditions of poverty and race in this country across the arc of history, we certainly see black and brown communities besieged and beset by all manner of injustices that are systemic, that are policy driven, that are crafted and created and driven and inspired by laws, policies. We have not always had 320 million guns, right? The NRA itself, if we want to go there, has not always taken the position it's taken with respect to we do the bidding of the gun industry. It's not always taking that position. If you look at the NRA in Canada versus the NRA in the United States, there's a profound ideological difference. And so the point being is we have to change communities, we have to change attitudes, but we have to go toe to toe and fight for reforms in laws. So specifically, where we've had instance after instance of families who are aware that their loved ones have a propensity for violence, who may engage in dangerous and antisocial behavior. Heretofore, there's been nothing that they could do. With a gun violence restraining order, you could go to law enforcement and get a restraining order, as in having guns taken away from someone who's demonstrating dangerous behavior within a constitutional frame, so that a mental health assessment might be made, a determination of whether or not this person should have a gun can be made. When I served on the transition team for the new governor in New Jersey, we made a strong recommendation for these kinds of restraining orders. That's policy, but it's policy that we put in the hands of ordinary folks with common sense who understand that Jamal Jr. is engaging in bad behavior, dangerous behavior, and we need to keep them away from guns or get the guns that they have away from them. My point being here, in the School of Theology, with this legacy that we have of morality and also policy reform, we cannot afford to do one or the other, because we will literally sacrifice the urgency of now for real reform that's sustainable.
I'd like to just add to that, because I believe that the both and are very important, and I think there are examples in the past where both social movements and public policy has changed when there's been enough collective action. And the Mothers Against Drunk Driving is an example that they organized across the country, and they effectively changed our laws around drunk driving that has saved countless lives. There's several women's organizations currently that are making the same attempt with around guns. The issue, I think, has to be that it has to be policy change at the local level, which we're seeing in many issues right now because of the federal administration. People have to begin to start acting locally, whether it's about laws about ecology or gun laws. That has to be taken on at a local level. Here in Massachusetts, we're quite, we have a better start than most states. But I think that the issue of collective action and being able to mobilize both your neighbor, your local community, and the federal government are essential. It has to go up at all levels. I'm not so, I believe it can change the federal government. I believe it can. We've seen other things
I'm a believer
change.
as well.
We've seen other things change, and I think that we have to figure out how to apply enough pressure at the right places.
We are dealing with data, right? And if we look at the data, it's silly talk for us to think that this is going to be the case. I mean, let me throw some more silly talk in here. Not everyone who commits an act of gun violence, even in a mass sort of way, is mentally ill.
That's right.
Right? And we have to remember that. So, oh sure, we'll take care of some of this, but go right back to my brother's point here. It's who. This is all this is about. But if we're really serious about gun violence, it's not just about mentally struggling people who are doing that.
That's right.
You know, some people are absolutely reasonable
That's right.
and rational in their violence and their use of violence. And, you know, the problem is that violence is a problem-solving tool, and we have this means that we put out there for people. Here's my other silly talk, because this is silly talk. If we look at the data, we keep saying it everywhere. We have to get rid of guns. If you look at the data, why do we let human beings who call themselves civilized, human beings who claim a moral high ground, people who will take an object, think about what a gun is. It is morally corrupt at its inception, right? A gun is meant to destroy a life, right? It's not meant for target shooting. The first gun was not made, or the first projectile weapon was not made to shoot targets. It was made to kill something.
That's right.
And so it just has at its core, a moral problem. And instead of us dealing with that, we say, well, because we needed to defend ourselves at one point from a government, and it was a long time ago, by the way. We'll keep it on the books because we've developed the culture around it. Well, you know, we gotta break gun culture. We talk all the time about breaking culture. And I just don't see how in 2018, once again, I like to think of myself as a cosmopolitan person, as a civil person, as a person who can look at data and facts. And I just don't see how in 2018 we think that we can let people own weapons. You know, when my kids were growing up, I would always ask when I took them over to play dates places, you got a gun in this house? And if somebody said yes, I said, well, I want to see how you got that gun locked up. I want to make sure my children cannot get to it. And as a matter of fact, I once said to someone, can I just take that and put it in my house while my kids are here? You can get it back. I didn't want my kids around a gun. So, you know, I think we got to look at the silly talk. We got to go silly. Let's repeal the Second Amendment.
Can I follow that silly talk for a second? I'd like to do this. So, you know, and I appreciate what you're saying. I think the both and is important. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm saying that, you know, sometimes we got to look at in the moment, who are we talking about? So I'll go back to that. But I think the other issue we have is this idea of, you know, how we think even in institutions about evidence-based practice. And one of the things that I always talk about is what about practice-based evidence? Because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to violence, I'm an expert. I had a gun to my head at 11 years old. And I had to understand how to navigate, survive that. I've been dealing with guns and toting guns all my life. I understand what this thing is really all about in this context, right? So we need to think about, like, how do we sort of honor the voice of everyone, again, in this conversation about gun reform? Because at the end of the day, we're not talking really about the act of using guns. We're talking about a traumatized community. We're talking about what, you know, years ago, the Pope had mentioned, and he was really talking about pregnancy and things like that, but he was talking about we live in a culture of death, right? And now we're living in a culture of violence, right? You turn on your TV, How to Get Away with Murder, right? The most explicit views of watching blood and things like that that are desensitizing our community, right? Taking away the humanity of our culture, our humanity of our communities, is what is actually allowing people to commit these insane acts. So I think about myself as someone who could see someone get shot and be back on that same corner the next day and not even like feel anything for that. And when God allowed me to transform my life and ask myself, and he answered me, how did this kid who was like an A student, who was ranked in tennis, who like went to a technical school, and then after 6th grade took a deep dive, how did that kid get to this place? And what it was what I said. It was these traumatic incidents that took place in my life that desensitized me to my own to other human beings. So I had lost the ability to have empathetic courage. I had lost the fiber of what we consider to be integrity. So until we start to really address the core issues that we face in this country around what we are promoting to human beings, and let's be clear, right? Guns were also not only used to protect, but they were also used to overpower. Right? In slavery, the ability to have a weapon that was strong and a gun meant that you could control people. So guns have not, this thing of gun conflict and abuse has been something that is embedded in the history. So we all have to figure out as a society, how do we take accountability for the role that guns have played in where we are right now? And that's on many different levels, and we have to peel those layers back, and there has to be, I think the fiber of this discussion and the fiber of this reform has to be a comprehensive approach. And one last point I would say, to the point that, I forgot your name, sorry. Cornell Brooks. About the idea of policy and a mother being able to call sort of and get a sort of restraining order on a child, right? The other problem that we have is then when you move that child, what happens to a child that's in a suburban neighborhood when that call is made, and what happens to a child that's in an urban community when that call is made is totally different. So if we don't change laws and policies from a comprehensive standpoint, we're still slamming the door on the issue.
So,
we want to open the floor to the audience. We have several people here that are eager to ask questions. We ask you only project from where you are so we can all hear you. Back and share.
So when I arrived in America, after maybe even before 1 week, somebody approached me with something like this and then asked me the money. First of all, I didn't know how to even speak English at that time, 1 week after the arrival of America. And the problem was I didn't know what that meant actually. Whether it's a gun or a knife, but somebody just asked me the money and so, oh, okay. Without any fear of guns. So as an international person, it was very actually interesting but very scary experience, and understand the America or the image of America is like, okay, the gun and violence, period. In Korean, we never allowed to have any guns, period. So when I came to America, it was like a totally different like culture. And wow, somebody is actually carrying the gun is like a new concept to me. So my question, now I know enough. Yeah, I lived here for a long time now. So my question is, how do you actually see this gun violence in terms of class and race? How does it actually combine? And does it really relate with also any international like relations? Does any other country allow to have the gun like America? Or America is the only place have to carry the gun or allowed to have the gun because of colonial, post-colonial power that America had?
So, I mean, I would argue that the gun culture in our country is embedded in the Constitution itself in terms of the Second Amendment. The ability of having guns in terms of state militias, having guns to defend yourself from some governmental threat, but also having guns to control communities of color, to subjugate communities of color, to subjugate slaves. Race and class and Constitution are deeply interwoven in terms of the gun culture and the culture of violence in this country, not just back then, but now. So this notion that we need these guns, for example, when the NRA talks about its members protecting themselves from gun violence, right? So we sell people on the notion that there's a threat around every corner and that you need not just guns that will take down a deer, take down an elephant, take down, but whole communities. The fact that we talk about, for example, bump stocks that basically turn semi-automatic weapons into proxy machine guns. And we make this fine distinction between, well, it's really not a machine gun, though it shoots almost as fast as a machine gun and it can kill as many people. That has everything to do not with just the legal arguments, the constitutional arguments, but our gun mindset. So now with respect to the international space, where we've had countries that have banned guns in response to a mass shooting and seen mass shootings essentially disappear. There are any number of countries around the world where you don't have suicides that are nearly suicide attempts that are as lethal. So 60% of our gun deaths in this country are suicides. People commit suicides in other countries, or they attempt to do so, but they may not be as effective. The point being here is, yes, we have examples around the world. We know what would happen if we were to abolish the Second Amendment and get rid of guns. People would not have the means by which to destroy themselves and destroy other people and to subjugate communities of color. But the fact of the matter is we have a Second Amendment. And the issue is, right now, in terms of preserving the lives that we can preserve and protect the lives we can protect, the issue is what can we do in that context in terms of limiting the access of guns with respect to age, raising the age limit, the background checks, the restraining orders, a number of strategies to try to lessen the access to guns. But I agree with the dean. As somebody who grew up in the South, grew up with plenty of guns, my father, I saw a group of racists threaten my family, try to drive us off the road, and I saw my father reach under his seat, take out his gun, point it at somebody and say, if you mess with my family, I will blow your head off. That was a very positive instance with the gun. But that being said, I don't think we need them. I think we're safer off without them.
I think it was the fact that gun sales went up a third when President Obama was elected, and they did the same when he was elected again, I think reflects the racism involved that you're speaking to, and the fact that when you think, I always think it's very important to look below the issue to the fear. What are the fears here? And when Obama was elected, I think the fear was, white population is decreasing, white supremacy is going down, we have a black president, and they want to keep their guns. They want to make sure they keep not only their protection in terms of bodily protection, but also the white supremacist culture. And I think what we're seeing now is the whole backlash from that. And so, it's very connected, I believe, to race and also the economic issues that you alluded to earlier, which is why I think that it's so important to approach this on a multi-layer kind of thing, and it's just not one answer. And we have to be willing to look at it. Who's used the term accountability? Our own accountability in this. One of the fastest, I should say, the group that is buying guns more than anyone else right now is women in this country. They're making pink handguns and rifles.
My mother used to call it Saturday Night Special.
Yeah. So, this is another whole area where I think we have to look at the issue of safety. Do guns make women safe? And how is it that we can have this conversation as women to women, about why are we going in this direction? Why are we following men down this road?
Some men.
Yes. The
Yes.
The other thing I think is very relevant to the issue of gun reform or gun control is the fact that, when we hear about sort of raising the age and all these other things, again, it's all relative, right? Because who's to say, in my community, right, it wasn't going to a gun show. It was that ex-police officer, that ex-military person who came to the neighborhood and opened up the trunk and said, here's what I got. So, you see, I'm saying when we think about an issue in the context of its sort of natural framework, we don't see the alternative approaches that are actually feeding the actual problem in specific communities. So again, we go back to the who. So you raise the age, you make it longer, you do background checks, but where's the checks and balances for the guy who's an ex-cop, an ex-military person who has access, that comes to an urban community and lifts up the trunk and says, hey man, you could buy 5 guns right now. Still doesn't stop the problem, right? Yeah. So again, it's looking at this from all the angles. I have an appreciation for what is happening on the legislative level around gun reform, but all I'm trying to do is say there's another conversation we need to have of how guns play a role and get to communities in the underworld. And unless we create checks and balances there, then we're only solving the problem for one set of people and leaving the problem open for another. This gentleman in the back has his hand up.
I wanted to, my question was about the degree to which gun violence is a problem about masculinity. And in light of Dr. Oleson, your comment about women being the fastest growing population purchasing guns, one of the things that we know is that in large measure, many women are purchasing guns not to protect themselves on the street, but to protect themselves from loved ones in their house who are threatening them with violence. Yeah. And the issue around the way guns are used inside of our homes. We can talk about guns on the street, but the vast majority of gun deaths happen within our houses. Yeah. Whether it's suicide or domestic violence perpetrated primarily, even the suicides perpetrated primarily by men. So how do we have a conversation around moral courage to talk about a different way of being men? Because our way of being men right now is connected too significantly to violence. How do we address that?
Yeah, and may I just add to that?
Yes, sir.
Like, moral courage, right? That's what the idea is. If you have enough moral courage, you can stop someone from committing these acts. well, who do we look for? Who do we look to like show us how to do this? Because if you look around, from politics to like economics to social issues, there aren't much heroes out there to show us how to do this. Like, look at the United States current political situation. Like, as an observer, not from this country, yet who has grown with, I grew up without the American culture, but yet American culture is everywhere. So you grow up within American culture. So as someone who has those two different outlooks, I don't personally see much heroes about it. It's shocking that if there are no heroes, you're going to be afraid.
Yeah.
If you're going to be afraid, you should defend yourself, because you don't have someone else looking out for your best interests.
That's right.
Who can like save you.
So this is, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So, in the same way that the Me Too movement is a response to toxic masculinity, our response to gun violence is also a response to toxic masculinity. Here's the reality. You know, men and boys are raised to respond with aggression, with violence, to perceived threats. Right? You know, as someone taught me as a young lawyer, litigation is violence with rules. Right? It's about beating, winning the other side, against the other side. And as a civil rights lawyer, I really took that view literally, right? We sue the other side, they've engaged in discrimination, we take as much money as we can, bankrupt them. That's how you talk. But that's really a translation of masculinity culture into the context of law. I believe the way we sell guns, the way we market guns, has everything to do with men acting out a sense of aggression. So fundamentally, that means changing those values. I think my brother is absolutely right in terms of, you know, that's got to take place in the community context. And I think my brother here is right in terms of we need heroes and heroines. But I would argue that every hero or heroine is not somebody you vote for, right? If you look at the history of movements in this country, it's largely not about the people who are in the House and Senate, but rather the people who are not in the House and Senate exercising influence over the House and Senate. So in other words, you think about Recy Taylor and Rosa Parks in the 1940s responding and reacting to toxic masculinity. Recy Taylor was sexually violated by 7 men. Okay? These women laid the foundation for the modern civil rights movement, really as a response to racial discrimination, but also a response to, I would argue, toxic masculinity. So this whole fight really is about really redefining what it means to be a man, redefining what it means to be masculine, and that's cool. That's not merely constitutional.
I don't think that's cool.
Yeah.
Cool?
To like redefine what it means to be a man.
You don't think it's?
Who determines that?
Yeah.
So who's gonna stand up and tell you this is what it means to be a man?
Yeah. So if I
argument in make.
Yeah, and if I could respond, I think one of the things we take for granted, again, going back to the trauma sort of informed approach to some of these issues, right? I think we take for granted, as I mentioned, I was incarcerated and I did 10 years of incarceration, and you know, one of the things that was shocking to me when there was a group of us who decided to create what's considered to now to be a healing circle. And what that healing circle consisted of was really all of us making a commitment to put our whole self on the table to heal, right? And what came out of that that was very interesting to me was the fact that we take for granted the amount of men that have been raped, right? The amount of men that have been socially abused, right? And we don't, so that's not even in the conversation about why, as a huge part of why men are actually abusive, right? Because they themselves have experienced trauma. And they themselves have been oriented to a culture of perpetuating control by physical prowess and dominance, right? So we've been there, right? I grew up with men who the conversation was about how you manipulate, you know, don't show emotions, you know what I'm talking about. If you're a man in this room, you know what I'm talking about, and how we take for granted that the social conditioning of those ideals actually detach us, again, not just from women, but just from our own humanity, our ability to feel for others, right? So when we talk about this system that we're living in and why we have all of these dynamics of violence in the home, violence outside the home, people wanting to shoot each other with guns, we have to stop, to me, stop dealing with the byproduct of these issues and really dig deep into where these issues actually come from. We've created a culture that has allowed people to walk around with pain, hurt, and trauma. And at some point, I don't care, now some people are more resilient than others, so let's not get it confused. You got politicians who face the same thing, and they just exercise their power and their abuse in a different way. And I learned that very clearly going mainstream. You know, I used to think that like, some of the worst people were the people I dealt with in the street until I became mainstream, and I said, wow, you know, you got people in the mosque that'll kill you the same way that somebody in the street will kill you. You got people in the church that's trying to sabotage you, but they too are people who have compound trauma that they're acting out in these systems and institutions. So until we start to really think about how do we regain and help people rebuild their humanity, and now, and I'll end on this note, more than ever before, the thing about, my family's from the West Indies, and so the thing about the sort of infection of sort of American culture, the West sort of masculinity culture, is social media. Because there was a time where cultures around the world, even in the South, you have places in the South that like, you know, you go to the South from the North, they'd be like, where you get them sneakers from? Who are you? Because you speak different, but now everybody's exposed to everything because of social media. So you really don't have to be a perpetuation, you really don't have to perpetuate violence to be someone who's attracted to violence, because you can see it on TV. You can go on the internet and you can become somebody who's traumatized and don't realize that you're being traumatized because of the things that you're exposing yourself to. So we live in a different time where the compound exposure to trauma is just, it's just terrible. And we have to figure out, I think, a way via legislation, you know, how to fetter media, social media, what we see on TV, all these things that I think that are just working against the humanity of human beings.
You know, we were asked to define moral courage, and I just want to interject this. I said it was the willingness to address and resist the normalization of violence in our culture, communities, and national policies. And speaking about other countries have a lot of the worse problems than we have in many respects, at least economically, and yet they don't normalize violence.
That's right.
And I think that's really key here in terms of taking some of the steps that you're talking about.
Let's get in a few more questions. We'll go to Maddie next.
Two parts. One, if you could each share a resource that we could take from this to learn more. And then the second question is, could you speak to how we can expand, especially nationally, the conversation about gun violence from just schools to, you know, suicides, other deaths from guns, without, or is it possible to do that without capitalizing on personal stories? And I ask this from the perspective of, I have a former student whose dad was killed with a gun last April. And so I could use his story, but it's not my story. And so how we expand this conversation without manipulating or capitalizing on people's pain.
So just quickly, I like the work of the Brennan Center, obviously ACLU, the Brady campaign, Brookings in terms of gun violence. There's just a number of organizations in terms of policy and prescriptions. But to your point about stories, one of the things I've found is somebody who's pushed forward and tried and passed with broad coalitions, fair amount of criminal justice reform, is stories are all powerful, right? So you can make the empirical case, you can make the policy case, but at the end of the day, when you go before a state legislature, when you go before Congress, if you marry the empirical to the narrative, people want to hear the stories. So you don't want to engage in kind of emotional or moral misappropriation of stories. But when people give you permission to tell those stories, or better yet, let them tell their own stories. If, I think that Parkland, there's race involved, there's the right victim, the perfect victim, if you will, in terms of suburban white youth as opposed to black and brown youth. But it shouldn't diminish the fact that we've seen cases around the country with black and brown communities and others who told their own stories, made the empirical argument, made the policy argument, and it actually passed legislation. So, you know, I think the dean has an empirical basis for his skepticism and a historical basis for his skepticism. But I would argue that, you know, hope, you know, is an existential necessity. You don't always have the basis for it. You can't always make the empirical case for it. But at the end of the day, it literally is an existential necessity. You have to have it. And so, yeah.
I'd like to add, David Hemingway's book, Private Guns, Public Lives, is a great analysis and very helpful in terms of looking at this issue and how to move forward with it. I would recommend Every Town for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense. And for anyone interested here at STH, RCT is going to organize a gathering point for anyone who would like to participate in the March for Our Lives on March 24th, which is a week from this Saturday. We'll send out a notice about how to connect there. So, see if others, other resources.
So as a resource, I think what, you know, I like these practical resources. So I like the Black Youth Project that's out there. You know, these are young Black folk who, sparked by the BLM movement, I think have been really doing a lot of what we're talking about, telling those stories, getting out there, doing there. And I think they offer, just by example, a good prescription of what might be there. You know, the other thing that I would say is a resource, you have to go into places you don't normally go into and talk to people. Go somewhere where you're not going to be hurt, that's not dangerous to you, do an assessment. But I really, you know, so I need to do more of talking to people who are okay with owning guns, obviously, right? I need to do more of that. I need to go into a place and have a beer with a group of folks and say, I need to comprehend you a little bit better. I need to understand, because I hope that through that, we can work on this together. So that would be my other piece too, is, you know, there is nothing like just talking to people. Talking to people to see where their resolve lies and where their commitments lie, and not to think that they're automatically crazy because of that. I don't think people who want to own guns are crazy. I don't. I understand why people want to do that. I really do. I legitimately do. But I think I could work with you on some place, in some place.
I have one other resource. You can go next.
Oh, I can go ahead. So one resource that I look at is the Trace. It's like a Bloomberg sort of gun violence. They came up with this whole thing where they're sort of tracking gun violence at a broader level. So a lot of information is on that site. And I forgot your other question. I'm sorry, the first question.
So it was about how we use stories beyond school shootings without capitalizing on it.
Yeah. So I would love to see, on the Trace they talk about this concept called, murder inequality. And this murder inequality is around the same thing we're talking about, right? How one subset of sort of incidents are highlighted or profiled and not another. I think we can do a better job at sort of telling the entire story. When I think about in this country why people are frustrated and actually being divided, I would say in a class system, for lack of a better word, at the bottom, because the issue in rural America is pretty much the same issue in urban America. And there's no bringing together of the fact that poverty-stricken folks who are being left behind have the same things that they desire and want together, but we're not having them sit together for the movement. And what's interesting in talking about this is that this is something that when even the Black Panther Party tried this, the government actually sort of destroyed and literally used guns, again, to assassinate leadership around the same thing. The effort to bring a community of white folks who were struggling and had issues with the government and Vietnam War, etc., together with poverty-stricken folks from urban America to say, we have an issue with the policy agenda that you have. And so until we start to, because another frustration I would say is that every time I sit at a university, I go to Harvard, I speak there, I'm here speaking, a lot of times when we talk about these issues in different ways, either we're dividing depending on what the issue is, or you're constantly seeing a black face. Right? So it's always holding up this sort of black and brown person to say, these people need, but I asked a question, I'm two classes away from getting my master's at Tufts University in public policy, and I asked a question in my housing class. I said, we were doing a project on poverty and housing developments and the history, right? And I digress a little bit, but stick with me. And so we did this whole class, and all of it was about the black community and housing. You know, Pruitt and I go. So I asked one question. I said, well, what happened to the white people? Because this wasn't originally for black folks. Where did the white people in these houses go? Like, what happened to them, right? And no one could answer the question. But again, it was, to me, what I was challenging us to do is to say, why aren't we talking about everyone who suffered at the hands of this system and not just one specific population? So I think we have to continue to push ourselves and have the moral courage to bring people together and say that these issues are relevant to not just one subset of people, but to all of us. And it's important to us as an institution and as a group of folk trying to create reform.
You know, and to go to your point a little bit more, you know, when you're talking about solidarity, right? We come together a lot, we come together, but you think about what solidarity is. That is me saying, yep, I'm gonna come together with you, but I'm gonna commit to do something with and for you, right? I'm gonna put my neck out there for you. And I hope you'll do the same for me, right? That's solidarity, and that's very different than us just getting together.
That's right.
Right?
That's
and,
right.
And I think we've gotta really push ourselves, you know, again, there is a moral imperative to be in solidarity, not just coming together. You know, the other thing too about stories, if I just jump in there one more time with that, you know, pop culture can offer great opportunities for us to think about stories. You know, I've been watching The Shy. It's about the story of guns and gun violence and revenge and vengeance in a community, in a neighborhood. And a lot of what we're talking about, different ways that it affects different people, that is very good. I'm a huge fan of The Wire. I just think that just gives you perspective. And so, you know, maybe pop culture also offers good storytelling in so many different ways.
I want to add, okay.
I just wanted to, because I thought it was such a great point about pop culture. When I was when I lived in New Jersey before going to NAACP, we were pushing for a package of bills concerning gangs and reentry. You know, literally trying to steer more resources toward helping people in gangs get jobs upon coming from prison. We did research studies, we did all that. But then we had the idea of literally going to a young filmmaker and putting Bloods, Latin Kings, Crips in a film with sociologists, the mayor, chiefs of police, criminologists, all talking about the same problem, to see if everyone was talking about the same thing. And amazingly, the 19-year-olds were saying exactly the same thing as the 50-year-olds, except in different language. The point being was, we use pop culture. Like literally, we filled the largest auditorium in downtown Newark with the biggest crowd in like 20 years. We had Goldman Sachs bankers, gang members, 15-year-olds and 50-year-olds in the same room. It's storytelling. You know, you put the music to it, you have a creative narrative, throw in the policy, the empirical argument, you get people's attention.
Another part of the story on the other end of the continuum, though, is the public record. And I think one of the stories we have to tell, and it's about accountability, is about holding our policymakers accountable for what they do and don't do. And I have a list if anyone is interested here, because I think government is important in terms of influencing them. The top senators who received the most money from the NRA, and the top U.S. representatives who received the most in the NRA, just the top two, John McCain, $7,740+ million over his career. French, top U.S. Representative French Hill, $1 million plus over his career. I'm sorry, $7 million plus and $1 million plus over his career, over the time period of his career. This is really crucial. We don't have campaign finance reform. We need to get there, but I think this is also part of the story that we need to tell, and we need to hold people accountable for it. And the number to call the Capitol switchboard is on here.
I think we have time now for 2 more questions. We'll go to Mr. Thomas and then end with Emily Lane.
So first off, thank you all so much. This is such a rich discussion and such a diverse panel of perspectives. I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm prior military and sort of from an indigenous community. Gun violence has been sort of a part of all 3 of those identities. In Los Angeles, I've seen gun violence from the policed and the police. As someone who was deployed overseas in the former Yugoslavia during the Bosnia conflict era, I've seen mass graves of young men lined up, shot, families, villages, whole. This has been an ongoing struggle for myself, is because part of the reason why I'm here is because I think there are so many people in this world, in this country, that want to be courageous. They really want to really gain some amount of moral courage. From a very pastoral perspective, I deal with things like doctrines, right? People are, the Bible has been it's a liberating sacred text, but it is also a very oppressive sacred text in the same sentence. And so this is how I see the Second Amendment, right? It is something that people find ultimate joy in, to be able to provide safety for their neighborhoods and their families, because this is the notion that's sort of perpetuated in national security and all that, is that we deal with safety, right? We want to make sure that our neighborhoods and our families are safe. Not to say that I subscribe to that, but I've also seen the other side, right, of that. And the reason why I'm here is because I think a large portion of this country needs direction. And I think if we don't start where we're really, sort of dabbling in it a little bit with the Second Amendment, this may be a question for Professor Brooks, and some of you also can share your reflections on that. But this notion of this doctrine of, being sort of founded, this is the absolute truth on the rights of everyone to bear arms, given the reality that that document was made, at a time when we didn't have semi-automatic weapons and mass destructive, tools of destruction here, and now we're still living like this. This is where biblical interpretation comes in, and contextual theology and all these, what I do here. I'm thinking to myself, why is this such a difficult thing to do with this doctrine, given the reality of so many mass shootings in this country, given mass violence that America causes all over the place? Not only America, but even in other countries who are experiencing internal conflicts within themselves, automatic weapons and all of these things. Why is it such a difficult topic for us to look at this Second Amendment and say, this document is flawed, it is outdated, we cannot continue to do this for the next 300 years and live like this as if it's pretty foolish, as you mentioned, that we still live and we are still having discussions around the Second Amendment.
Yeah. So, it's such a powerful statement and question. At the end of the day, the Supreme Court and the country are faced with really a question of constitutional hermeneutics, not unlike biblical hermeneutics, right? So you have, say, someone like Justice Scalia, originalist, textualist, and then you have someone like a Justice Brennan or Justice Thurgood Marshall who believe more in the Constitution as a living, breathing document reflecting current realities. So it's a war of constitutional interpretation, schools of hermeneutics, if you will. But coming out of the law school I came out of, the legal realist movement, i.e., Supreme Court justices are about who you put on the bench. It's about the exercise of power too. And so we need people on the court who understand these realities and who are not textually hidebound. Because I agree with you that the country, the Heller decision, the decision about does the Supreme Court, I should say, does the Second Amendment convey gun rights in terms of individuals, or is it in terms of state militias? Is it more communal? Has everything to do with that Supreme Court justice. But getting back to your point about courage, if we think about the story of the Good Samaritan, right? So the Good Samaritan was not merely compassionate, but the Good Samaritan was brave, right? So in other words, you didn't know whether or not the robbers were going to come back, okay? And I would argue if the Good Samaritan is concerned enough about the next person who's waylaid, the next person who's robbed, the next person who's subject to violence, you demonstrate that courage by addressing the problem systemically. Again, I go back to legislative reform. I'd certainly argue at the local level, but ultimately, we got to do something about the Supreme Court, right? Because it has if we are going to bring about any reform, the holy grail here is the Second Amendment, right? 320 million guns in this country, right? That's enough for every child, every boy, every teenager in the country, in multiples. That's where we have to go. And in that respect, the dean, though skeptical, is right.
So, I think it's also important to remember that many countries have successfully collected their arms. They paid people $400 or $500 to turn in their arms. That's been successfully done in many communities, and it's possible here with that kind of moral and legal authority.
Yeah, but you know, the tough part is that we have said this is our God-given. Remember, the Constitution is God-given, right? This is God-given. It is our God-given right. We were born to own these things. We were born. Right? Yeah, right, that's true. I got you. Theoretically, we were born.
Some of us were born 3/5.
Yes, I get that. But the good Lord gave us a particular province with this thing. And I think that's the difference, though. In Australia, they didn't have that, right? They weren't working with a Second Amendment, and they weren't working from a constitution that came from God. So I think that, you know, once again, there's that big cultural hurdle that's there. And we buy into it, and we stay with it. I'm with you about the Supreme Court. The people on the Supreme Court don't live in the same world we all live in. But systematically, how do you do that? How do you change that? Then you do have to go back to the legislature, right? It's about who the president is. A Supreme Court justice is a judge who knows the president.
Can I share one thing on personal reform? Because when I think about all of this, I think about how in some places, for me, you know, maybe it's because I'm maybe a generation, I feel like we still operate as slaves. I feel like we still operate as slaves because we're asking someone else to sign a document that changes the way we think, the way we operate, the way we move, right? And so, you know, I think about how my decision-making changed when how I viewed the world changed. Because I could have stayed a gun toter, regardless of the Second Amendment. I didn't even know what the Second Amendment was, but I knew what a gun was. None of that really mattered. But what mattered was that when I had an opportunity to challenge my own moral fiber and to really think about what I want my future to look like, my decision-making changed. And that gun didn't matter anymore to me. The legislation and the Constitution didn't matter anymore to me. What mattered was that I knew that there was a God that's greater than me, that's watching me, and that if I don't follow a certain order, my life is going to go down a rabbit hole. And so but we live in a society now that you can't even have that conversation really, right? So when we start talking about morals, sometimes if you bring a moral conversation to the commoners, you're ostracized. You can't have a moral conversation. You can't talk about God. We can't pray in school anymore. You can't. So when we start to remove, right, and this is where for me, and even with young folks, we live in a society that's very contradictory and hypocritical. You know, coming up as a kid, I saw adults as hypocrites because I said, in one sense, you're saying, I can't do X, Y, Z. But when I stand in the corner and watch you over there, you're doing X, Y, Z. And I had to understand that when God labeled right from wrong, he didn't say, if you're 15, you can't do this, and if you're 21, you could do this. He says, this is the principles. And if you abide by these principles, they will lead you to either a place of peace and tranquility or damnation. You choose. And that was whether you're 15, 16, 21, 30, or 50. So I think the conversation we have about morality and spirituality and how it fits into the context of the society we live in now, we have to change, and we have to have the moral courage to stand up for what is considered to be moral and not operate as if a signing of a document is going to change how people operate in our society. To me, that's the slave mentality.
Emily, you waived your question and gave it up for this gentleman.
Oh, well, no, thanks. I was just going to mention one aspect that we didn't talk about at once, talking about big change. So we've talked a lot about moral change, which starts at least by talking about how we act ourselves and others, and we've talked about legal change, but somewhere in also is, and that's been very important for supporting the gun culture, has been economics. Mm-hmm. And the two things I think of, just to throw out as examples of something that would make a big difference, are if the legal protections and shields for gun manufacturers and gun sellers were removed, so that any time anybody was injured by a gun, they had the capability of suing the person who shot, the person who sold them the gun, the company that manufactured the gun, you know, and just work those out, that it could go like tobacco did once that broke through, that you had tobacco liability. And another one like that is if life insurance was allowed to be indexed to whether you had a gun in the home, just like it is your life insurance and health insurance go with smoking, where if you're a smoker, you know, you're on one schedule. If you have guns in your house, at least for some people, it'd be a big impact of these people who think, well, I have it for safety, there's no cost, and I don't believe in the risk. Just say, oh, by the way, you can't get life insurance, or you're going to pay twice as much. So, I mean, again, to make that happen requires what we're talking about, but once it does, it gives you the kind of lever. You know, if everybody said, I'm going to save over my lifetime $10,000 on life insurance payments if I turn in my guns, there will be people who would take that into account. Maybe not all the ones you want. The ones who would be left, they are crazy.
Well, you almost talking about having a level of strict liability for guns, right?
Yes.
For the use of a gun. You know, you lose your gun and it gets used in a crime. Strict liability.
Right. You trace it, and
you should pull the trigger yourself.
And stuff like putting taggants in all bullets, right, so that any time you had a bullet used, you could trace where it was manufactured and what lot it came in and who and where it was bought, and the same thing for the bullet.
Just very quickly to add to what this gentleman is saying, there is a campaign.
This gentleman is the great Professor Roscoe Giles. Long-time Boston University. He's been holding us up for a long time.
But in terms of economic solutions, there is a campaign. I used to pastor in Connecticut. We were part of a faith-based organizing group called Metro IAF. It's across the country. And the campaign we had called Do Not Stand Idly By, which tried to use market-based strategies to deal with gun violence. So 60% of gun manufacturing profits are from government or government-controlled entity purchases. So what we did was we went to government agencies and government entities, police departments, Massachusetts, Connecticut State Police, and tried to get them to commit to only buying their guns from manufacturers that would use trace tags on bullets, that would put wrist bracelet controlled guns in the hands of police departments, state troopers, and so on, so that if you were not a company that was going to abide by these methods that allowed you to trace and track guns and gun violence, we were not going to purchase from you. That's been happening for about 7 years, and it's had some success in about 4 or 5 states, but that's just another example of people saying, government's not going to do it, we got to hit them in the pocket. And so we can go to individual chiefs of police or governors or mayors and say, you can still get your guns for your people. Just buy from this company that's doing it this way. It'll put pressure on the other ones who are not to begin to manufacture this way. So that's another angle that people may not know about that's happening right now. Not just here, but it's been more successful in Europe than here. We're trying it now in the United States.
Thank you both for that wonderful question and statement. We're at the end of our time. So we're going to ask the panelists for closing statements or benediction, if you will. So we'll begin with Mr. Forrester and work our way down.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for hearing my point of perspective. I really appreciate that. I pray that I haven't said anything that is offensive to anyone. I'm only speaking from the heart and with true concern about individuals in our society that's dying from violence. I'm not just thinking about people who look like me and that I can relate to. I think we have a broad-based issue here that we're dealing with. And I hope that through these conversations, these conversations will lead to some form of action. that we all can think about what can we do on a small level, on a collective level, to support creating overall comprehensive change to our system.
Right, isn't that the only solution that is open for us right now? Because it's clear that the political situation is not working. So people, just like the Montgomery bus boycotts, wasn't it that the government didn't have a problem, but the people had a problem? And so they said, you know what, we're gonna act. We don't need your leeway, we don't need your permission to change how we live our lives.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that the only way this situation is gonna be solved? Because this situation is very simple to solve if we're all honest with each other. And the problem is there is a lack of honesty going on around this discussion, but even beyond that, the Afro-American, the Native American, they will all attest that once the honesty is in the air, that's when people can start making changes. So until the real reason gun control has not been addressed, until that is actually shared, because you saw President Trump in one of those rare moments, he asked a group of his people, he said to a group of his people, oh, you guys are afraid of the NRA, right? That was a joke, but it was very telling because the way they responded clearly showed that they were afraid of the NRA. So just watching that should be enough to tell people we cannot rely on these people to change the laws in our favor because they are afraid of the repercussions, their own personal repercussions. So isn't it that if we really want this to change, we have to get together, just like they did in the civil rights movement, just like any other movement. You don't need permission to change these laws.
So I want to say this to you, my brother. I look forward, just so for the sake of time, and I know we have to move on, I look forward to having follow-up conversations with you and thinking about the activism that you're talking about. Because again, everything that I focus on is brought about the urgency of now. And that urgency of now calls for a voice like yours in a collective way, working with leadership like that's up here and saying, how can we really formulate a real, again, comprehensive plan to really address this issue? We can talk till we're blue in the face. We gotta walk the walk. Thank you.
You should have pulled up a seat.
Well, I just wanted to close with the encouragement for all of you as faith leaders or future faith leaders to think about really challenging what's going on in our own Christian community. There's a whole component of the Christian community that is very pro-guns and integrates religious liberty with the right to bear arms. That connection is lethal. And I think that as people of faith, we need to somehow work with our brothers and sisters in faith to challenge that ideology. Secondly, there's a large component of right to life groups in our Christian community that are silent on this issue. I think we really need to engage that group and again challenge them. This is a right to life issue, and incorporate them. And then finally, research and write and research. As leaders of faith, I think there is that desire for people to have a moral voice. I think that people are hungry for that. And you all are in a position to do that.
It's an interesting observation that I have about the society, and that is that this issue is really the emperor with no clothes, and we're doing everything we can around it to accommodate. So while we're accommodating, perhaps what we need to do is to find a way to put some moral grounds on owning a gun. Maybe that is precisely what needs to happen, and all of the sorts of things that we hear around it, whether it be the economic, the political, or so on and so forth that we might have. Maybe the body of this is, here is the moral grounds for having the gun. Here is the Bible for how you must act if you have this thing called a gun. So we may have to create a new normal, but just understand that, and again, put the crazy talk aside, there will be guns. People will have guns. We will not get rid of guns. So while we're at that, let's make sure that we have a set of moral principles around the ownership of those things, the responsible ownership of it, real responsibility. And then finally, again, big shout out to Dean Moore for calling us together.
Just to reiterate the Dean's point, we all owe a debt of gratitude to our moderator, certainly the panelists, all of you who are taking time out, particularly on this day, to have this conversation. I go back to where we began. This conversation is taking place in the Boston University School of Theology. It is in this place we have had no small number of prophets who have gone forth into the world to lead and facilitate and support justice movements. So I don't believe that we need to be unduly resigned to the state of affairs. And as somebody who once led the NAACP, I bear in mind the organization came into being as a result of violence. A race riot, lynchings in the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. And over the course of 100 years, or the better part of 100 years, fought against lynching, a brutal form and efficient form of violence. The NAACP started with the goal of bringing about federal legislation to end violence, lynching. They didn't succeed passing federal legislation, but they did in lynching. The point being here is you try lots of tools. You engage in a multivalent strategy. You don't give up. And you definitely do not concede victory to government simply because it's government. The Congress we have has not always been the Congress we have. The Supreme Court has not always been this way. Certainly the White House has not always functioned this way. The point being here is if you have faith in our moral capacity, our civic capacity, our resilience, then you fight. And you fight, and you fight, and you fight. That's just, that's how I was trained here. And in the 20+ years, I've not really changed much. That has everything to do with the durability of the education here. So you all be aware, when you graduate, things really don't change.
Except tuition.
Yeah, that's right.
Round of applause. For helping us host this event. Thank you for the RCT, which stands for Religion and Conflict Transformation Program, the Community and Spiritual Life Office, and the Association of Black Seminarians for co-sponsoring this. We do have a survey that has been passed out, and we would love for your feedback. We do want to continue the conversation and build on this moment. So if you could be as honest as you can, it would be very helpful to us. Thank you again.